Hello and welcome to On the Irregular with me, Java Beret, a podcast where I chat to women from all walks of life about their own unique creative journey, how they got here, how their story has shaped their creative work, what they've learned, what has helped them, and where they plan to go from here. It's an irregular journey for so many of us, and I'm delighted to offer a platform to share these fascinating stories and wells of wisdom. In this episode, I chat to creative coach Kathryn Ho, or as she describes herself on Instagram, psychological witch and self-doubt coach. This felt like a deeply thoughtful and delicate conversation. Kathryn's meditative pace and considered answers to my questions led us to the big questions, the big feelings, the essence of it all in many ways. We talked about her awareness of the arbitrariness of life from a very young age, her experience of art school, existential pain, questioning the concept of fulfilling your potential, the idea of needing to assign yourself a label as a creative, and her gentle approach to coaching. Welcome to my conversation with Kathryn Ho, a creative coach for the mind and the soul. Morning!
Good morning.
How are you?
Slightly tickly throat, unfortunately. Poor timing on my part.
Well, that's good because I'm really croaky, so we can just meet each other with our tickly, croaky voices.
I'm also going to apologise in advance for my slightly squeaky chair. I'm sorry. I will try to stay firmly in one place. We'll see what happens.
I think everything squeaks in my house. I don't think there's a single thing that doesn't squeak. Okay, thank you so much, Kathryn, for agreeing to talk to me and share your story and more about your work. You've sent me some stuff that you wrote about your journey, and I'd really love it if you could tell me if you'd like to share a bit about your background, where you came from, because I know that you, from what you've written, you said that you were a grade A student and academically very strong, and that you somehow then ended up going to art school, and that really threw you because you knew that you needed to meet a certain grade or a certain expectation, but you were confused as to how to get there. And I thought what was really interesting is because so many people I've spoken to, they talked about often when if they were academically quite strong or met those grades, that they were really veered towards doing something like something proper, something that people would consider to be a proper job rather than being a creative. So I find it really interesting. I'd love to know more about how you ended up at art school, like through your childhood, had you always been felt creative? Tell me, start from the beginning.
Oh, this is a good question. This is where do I start? So I'm going to start at the point that comes up for me, which is essentially that question of what do I do with my life? What do I do with myself? Mm-hmm. Probably when I was thinking about university choices. Mm-hmm. And this might sound a little bit arrogant, I don't know, but I was in the very fortunate position that I went to, a proper, like a good school, all that kind of stuff. And I had the choice of I could do whatever. So I could have probably gone and studied whatever I wanted to. I would have had the grades, I would have had the background. People would have probably let me into their university to study their course. Mm-hmm. And I don't know about you, but that can feel a little bit overwhelming.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The idea of all these life choices. And I was like, well, what do we do about that? And something that has always shown up in my life, and I can remember this from when I was 5 or 6 going to school, was that so much of life felt very arbitrary. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that was that I just didn't understand what we were doing here. I didn't understand the meaning of life, and I was curious about that. So I was that kid at school who would read like Aesop's fables to understand the meaning behind life and the lessons.
Yes. Yes. Oh God, I can totally relate to that. And it's never even occurred to me, but I used to do exactly the same. I felt so desperate to understand. So just read anything I could to try and understand. Gosh, and that's a really big question at such a young age.
Yeah, I mean, I was that weird kid that basically spent my breaks reading Aesop's fables, and then I hung around. I think she was a dinner lady, but she was essentially an adult that was supervising us at break time.
Yeah.
And instead of playing with the other kids, I would ask like her all these questions.
And how did she respond?
I don't know. I honestly don't remember. My memory is incredibly poor when it comes to life events, but I do know that we must have been quite fond of each other because when I left that school, she gave me a pendant, like a necklace pendant in the shape of a hedgehog,
Oh,
and I've still got that.
oh, that's so beautiful. Oh my goodness, I can imagine. I mean, it's kind of unusual to have a child, chatting with you in that way. So I can imagine it must have felt, yeah, quite significant for her.
Yeah, no, Mrs. Seabrook, thank you very much. I've still got, I've still got it. So yeah, all that's to say is that my understanding of, I mean, I really enjoyed school. It provided the structure that I so wanted. I remember when I was again 5 or 6 and I was at school and my idea of heaven at school was that we all had these like learning pods, that like our desks were kind of encased in these pods and we were almost isolated to get on with the interesting work of learning about life and learning about how things worked. Yeah, that was my utopia.
To focus, just truly focus.
And yeah, so anyway, that's to say that I enjoyed the structure of school.
Yeah.
It provided this kind of structure and control, and I knew what I had to do, which I liked. It occupied my mind, essentially, is what I'm trying to say.
Mm-hmm.
But I think what I hadn't really appreciated was that it was kind of like school was this ladder to university, and that was basically the limit of my understanding. Like
Mm-hmm.
obviously intellectually, I understood that there's a life that you build after that,
Mm-hmm.
but I hadn't really connected with that idea.
Mm-hmm.
It was almost like an intellectual exercise.
Okay.
You jump through the hoops, you tick the boxes, you pass the grades, etc. And so when I got to the end of the ladder and it was like, right, well, now it's time to choose the university, I was like, oh no. I haven't actually, funnily enough, given it that much thought.
Yeah. Because what did you enjoy doing?
Um, I enjoyed science and maths and thinking about things.
Okay.
So it's interesting. I liked learning for learning's sake.
Mm-hmm.
I loved maths and science because they had the correct answers. Essentially, if you understood what was being asked of you, you could provide the correct answer. I loved balancing equations, for
Yeah.
example.
Yeah.
That provided that it was just really satisfying. Whereas English, history, you had to write an essay and it was subjective and it was open to interpretation.
Yeah.
I wasn't such a massive fan of that, I'll be honest.
Okay.
Um,
So what the hell led you to going to art school?
it's a very good question. I still haven't answered that, have I? In my last few years at school, we were given the option. I think you do like in Scotland, you do hires and you
Yeah.
take 5 hires, and there are 6 columns or periods that you choose. So essentially, you do 5 subjects and you have one set of periods that's like for free periods for study. And this just I just didn't want to do that. And I was like, no, I can't be bothered with having all these free periods to be with myself and study. So I thought I would just take an extra subject. And that happened to be art. Because I was like, oh, I've got a mild interest. I knew I could draw.
Mm-hmm.
So that seemed like a plus point. And I thought, well, that'll be interesting. So I did. I took art and I enjoyed drawing. I know this sounds really weird, but it was like that was kind of the limits of my thinking. And what I really liked was that it gave me a certain freedom to basically explore whatever interest I had.
Okay, yeah.
So when I went to university, well, when I was choosing the idea, I was like, well, I could do maths, I could do science, I could do art, was probably my thinking. And my understanding of science was that it was a very stereotypical view. It's like, oh, well, you study science, probably get a job in a lab, probably have to be told, right, well, this is the research that you're doing. It's going to be very constrained, and it might be incredibly frustrating. My brothers, like I've got two brothers, they are both scientists. I would actually say that experience kind of lines up. So it wasn't completely without.
That's really interesting that you kind of, it feels like there's a duality there of you needing to kind of understand the definite answer, but at the same time knowing that there's a bigger question that you want to explore, through, enjoying, like you said, maths and science, and you get to a correct answer, but that there was like a niggling, like, oh, but there's more, like you just said, like a bit more freedom, and that I can imagine that being quite a conflict in some ways.
That's a good word.
Yeah.
I think that's a common theme, a common tension. And you're right. I think that for me, the idea of going to art college was that, again, it seemed like this, a bit of a black hole, a bit of a mystery. And there was something inside that said, this is going to be a challenge. This is the path where you don't know what happens.
Yeah.
The path of science in my head was, well, there's a particular route. It's probably quite prescribed. You kind of know what you're going to get. And there was something in me that kind of knew, or felt for me anyway, that I'm not sure that that's what I wanted my life to look like. Even though that's what it had looked like up to that point. I was almost like, well, I know what that road looks like in a way, whereas I didn't know what this other path looked like. And so it was, in hindsight, maybe quite brave of me, or just relatively with ignorance. So I was like, okay. It went against a lot of what I had been brought up with. I specifically chose to go to Dundee because in Scotland there are, forgive me anyone who disagrees, but there are basically 4 kind of main art colleges. There's Glasgow, Edinburgh, Dundee, and Aberdeen. And essentially, I couldn't go to Edinburgh because I lived in Edinburgh. I didn't want to stay at home. I almost knew that I had to push myself out of that comfort zone. Glasgow and Aberdeen, for different reasons, I didn't want to do their courses. So to be honest, I kind of ended up in Dundee by default. I had no connections. I was somewhat concerned that I'd made a mistake when I arrived. I felt so out of my depth, but I don't know, maybe everyone feels like that.
Yeah.
Starting out like that.
Back in, going somewhere where you don't know anybody and you're kind of, what am I doing? I can completely imagine that. Yeah. And then how did you find the experience of being there? Because you wrote a bit about it. Do you want to share that?
Yeah. So I crashed and burned. Basically, long story short, I found it infuriating. I found our college so infuriating. I hadn't realized, although it's very obvious in hindsight for me now, how much I wanted to feel in control. How much I wanted to feel in control of my environment and what I was doing. And in art college, that just wasn't there. I just felt out of my depth. I was being asked to experiment with things, but it felt very vague as to what was expected of us. And that, for me, was just, what's the word? It was just incredibly challenging. Like I had grown up understanding these are the expectations for you, whether they're implicit or explicit. Even if they were implicit, I could normally figure out what was expected of me. It wasn't difficult.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas art college, I was truly flummoxed as to what was expected.
Mm-hmm.
And I did not like that.
Yeah. Yeah. I can understand that. Yeah. And so how did that manifest?
How did that manifest? Probably, the phrase acted out comes up, but just did all the stereotypical things. I got very angry, actually. I didn't have any other language for it. I knew I was angry. I didn't know what I was angry about. I had so little in terms of emotional vocabulary, and I was so disconnected from my feelings that I could understand I was angry, but that was basically the limit of it. And because I'm quite an internal person, it was very easy to reflect that anger on myself. Because obviously I was defective, so I'd done something wrong. Clearly I wasn't getting it. I was, too stupid to understand what was happening. I was very, very harsh on myself.
Yeah. God, that sounds so hard. And so young.
Yeah. It's funny. Part of me feels like that part of me knew I needed to get this out of the way relatively early on in my life. Looking back, it's kind of like I felt like this was probably always going to happen. And I kind of knew that if I'd gone down another route, the safe route, the route that was expected of me, I could easily have seen myself blowing up at, say, 40 or something. So I am actually very, very grateful for the part of me that had that inkling that this was maybe just something I needed to go through.
Wow. Yeah, I can see that. And so you ended up leaving art school, didn't you?
I was asked to leave.
Is this because they could see that you were in distress?
They could see I was in distress because I threw chairs to show that I was in distress. I ran through the corridors screaming. They could see that I was in distress. I was basically I didn't know what to do. People would call that a typical like cry for help, isn't it? And it was genuinely me not understanding how I ask for help or what was required. And I've never been a stereotypical people pleaser, so I didn't have a major issue with people in a funny way not warming to me. In fact, to be honest, that's been a major theme throughout my life. I've moved around a lot. I lived in Hong Kong for a bit, and I think I've lived in. I don't know how many places I've lived, but I've certainly been to I think 6 different schools. And for some people, the way that they adapt to that is that they get very good at making friends quickly or connections and relationships, and they know how to get people to like them, essentially. And I was the complete opposite of that. I decided that it wasn't worth my time getting to know people.
Yeah, I can understand that.
It was just less energetic kind of investment on my part.
Yeah, when you've got bigger questions to be asking and bigger things to be figuring out, Yeah,
I mean, when there's a whole world in your mind, and that's interesting enough, why would you bother engaging with the external world?
Yeah, no, I can see that. Gosh, so that's really interesting you're saying about how in a way you were able to act out because you didn't feel a need to please anybody. It was very much, this is what I'm going through and this is how I'm responding to it. And in a way, that feels like a far more direct route to getting to where you need to be. Like not taking anyone else into account or worrying about what people think of you. It's like, no, this is what I'm going through. I'm
Yeah.
experiencing it and I'm feeling it and I'm acting out. And yeah,
I
that's,
wish I could say that I had such clarity about what I was doing.
yeah.
I distinctly remember, because I was in a relationship with this guy that had actually was in my we met each other in halls, and he very much cared about me and I very much cared about him. But I distinctly remember he asked me, is this behavior deliberate? Are you in control of this? Are you choosing to do this? Because I was doing and saying some quite horrible, spiteful things.
Mm-hmm.
And I just remember thinking I was an evil person.
Mm. That's a lot to carry.
Yes, it was. It was. Yeah, I mean, it's you question everything,
Yeah.
and I very much didn't understand what was driving me. I think it was because I wanted to drive people away. I didn't want them involved. I wanted to show people I really am as horrible as you think I am. It's like, I'll prove you. I'll prove it. But so I now have the clarity around what was happening, but certainly going through that, I was very distressed.
Yeah. Yeah, it sounds like it. And so how did you, when you were asked to leave, did that feel like a relief?
I, maybe. I don't know. I think potentially yes,
Mm-hmm.
because everything was unknown. Like so, this point, I was like in a place where it's unfamiliar to me,
Mm.
and at that point, I didn't really understand what I was supposed to do to get better.
Mm-hmm.
I remember speaking with one of my many, many, many therapists, and because basically when I went to therapy, I played games. I just played intellectual games, and I didn't really get anywhere with a lot of it. Until actually one of them said that this was a wake-up call for me. But I started to want a session with this new therapist, and I played the standard games. And we just went around in intellectual circles, and she essentially said, "I see through you. I see through your games. I could have you sectioned." I
Wow.
was like, "Oh wow."
Okay.
That's pretty harsh and direct, and it completely got to me, like very much upset me.
Yeah.
And I left that session and I never went back to her, but she totally in hindsight did me a favor,
Mm-hmm.
because up until that point I just hadn't, I don't want to say I had taken things seriously, but I'd been going through the motions. I hadn't wanted to engage.
Yeah.
Whereas I think someone saying that was like, oh, do I want that to be my future?
Yeah.
So it gave me some questions. But anyway, different therapist. So essentially, this was a very, I'd left university by this point. I was very much adrift. I remember speaking to this therapist, and I just remember saying, like, it feels like I'm on this, like the side of a canyon, and I'm supposed to get to the other side of this canyon, but I don't know how.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's literally like impossible,
Mm-hmm.
and that's what it feels like.
Yeah. And what did you think was on the other side of the canyon?
Redemption.
Oh, that's an interesting
um
word.
I don't know, I mean, that word comes up because it's kind of what I feel like was expected of me in a way. Like I feel like I didn't really have many other options at this point, so maybe that would be some sort of redemption, acceptance, integration back into society.
That's interesting, because when you wrote to me, I noticed the word that you mentioned. One of your fears is disconnect, to be disconnected. I thought that's an insight into, I guess, a fear. And so you felt like you wanted to be integrated, and is that because you felt like you were still trying to understand what was the point, or why we're here? What's the point of being here? What are we doing?
So interestingly, as you say that, I don't think I really did want to be integrated or connected. I wanted to be intellectually I wanted that, as in, this is what I need to do to get back into university, to get back on living my life. But at that stage, I was still hugely, hugely uncomfortable with any sort of connection.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Have I always found that? No, I don't know whether, I know from a very young age that I have, for lack of a better word, like checked out. I've always wanted to go into my own mind.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that lots of people listening will very much relate to this.
Mm-hmm.
It's a way of, I think for me, it's always been a way of regulating the intensity of just our general life experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There's something soothing
in
being able to occupy your own mind. And don't get me wrong, I absolutely love that. But I think for me personally, it very much then becomes a mechanism by which you can almost just numb out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't take away the pain that you, for whatever reason, are experiencing. Right now, even, now I've gotten so much better at being able to recognize this. Mm-hmm. So I am very much prone to disconnecting. It's almost habitual and it's almost slightly unconscious. But I've now gotten much better at recognizing signs when that happens. Like, I can see that I'll be thinking of myself as doing things, and I'll be almost projecting as if I was a couple of feet forward of myself.
Mm-hmm.
I will very much quickly go into everything is arbitrary. There is no point to anything. And everything feels like an intellectual exercise of pick and choose this, but ultimately everything's meaningless. Mm. And when I notice I'm doing that, I'm like, oh, I'm really, really disconnected from my body here. Mm-hmm. I'm very much in my head. And that's how I have been for probably about 25 years or something. That was the way that I have operated. Mm-hmm. And interestingly, when I now notice that I can, if I choose, bring myself into a state where I can focus on just the energies that are going through my body. Mm-hmm. And when I do that and I'm in this particular state, it's normally the reason that I don't want to be in my body is because as soon as I connect to the energies that are going through my body, it's very, very sad. And there's nothing wrong with that. But it's just something that we, and I say we, society, culture, goes, well, that's not really what's meant to happen, is it?
Yeah. It's hard, it's uncomfortable.
Yeah, it is uncomfortable. And I am very grateful for this reminder in the back of my mind that goes, yep, this is uncomfortable. But the alternative is to go so far the other way that you feel completely desperate.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
which is also fairly uncomfortable.
Yeah. Gosh, this is a lot of inward, I suppose, introspection and learning about yourself from a very, very young age. And I think it's interesting what you were saying about how there was something within you that knew you were going to arrive at these points at some point, whether it's when you're 40 or when you're 20, whenever. And it's really huge to have to start that process at such a young age, and for it to come out so, what sounds like quite violently.
I was going to say that's the exact word that came to mind.
Yeah. Yeah. And to then come back from that, or not come back from it, but then live with that, and like you say, to some degree integrate back into society, because yeah, it's hugely disruptive. And you then, because you then didn't, you found a job, was it at a website company?
Yeah, so a web design creative agency.
Yeah.
What's interesting for that first experience is that what I would say is that going to therapy gave me some language, some understanding of some narratives that had very much influenced my way of thinking. There was always things about don't waste time. There's always been this thing about potential, which has always been this kind of looming thing. I have an interesting, people say, and actually in the coaching sphere, people talk about fulfilling your potential.
Yeah.
And in some ways, there's something lovely about that, like the idea of, say, a seed or the acorn growing into this tree, this magnificence. That's its potential. But on the other hand, I wonder if we sometimes apply a very man-made concept of potential.
Yeah.
It's almost like a measurement, a machine, the quantities, what can you produce with that potential?
Yeah. It's kind of quite a capitalist perspective in a way, isn't it? How productive can you be?
And I wonder, when it comes to, I still don't know what I kind of tend to shy away from that word potential as a human being, because if I was going to look at it as if I was a tree, then all I really need to do is just basically be thriving. And what does thriving mean? Well, thriving, honestly, all I can think of is just like frolicking in a field and just kind of living. Thriving does not mean I have acquired any particular capital. It does not mean that I've got a house. It does not mean that I've got a particular set of assets. It just means that I live in nature. And when I say I live in nature, I don't mean that I actually live in a tree house. It just means that I am able to be with whatever's around me. And there's that word connection that comes up again.
Yeah. And again, that kind of, I guess that sounds like the answer to what you were asking yourself when you were a child. Like, what is this about? Why are we here? What are we doing? And you've just said very simply, very beautifully, living in nature, purely living and being connected to the world around us. And it's so simple, isn't it? But to get there, can be so hard and so painful.
Yeah, it's a problem that I wanted to solve.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something I often say to my clients, actually, is that I am now somewhat skeptical whenever someone talks about, say, a concept. I think I was talking with a client we were talking about priorities the other day, and the idea of a priority is incredibly useful in very specific contexts.
Mm-hmm.
It's not, or I want to say it's not so helpful, or I'm slightly skeptical when it comes to applying that very man-made concept to the experience of living your life.
Mm-hmm.
Like as an umbrella, I would not recommend applying that to the whole of your life.
Yeah.
And similarly, that problem, that like problem to be solved,
Yeah.
I don't really see there that much in, like, I don't really see that approach in nature.
Yeah.
I mean, don't get me wrong, things happen in, you could say, well, there has been, how would I put this? There's been a challenge and nature has, in quote unquote, like solved it. But that's not the approach. That's actually completely different. It's much more creative, organic, messy than that. It's not we don't work things out in a formula.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's what I was trying to do all those years.
This episode is sponsored by gardener and virtual planting plan designer Heidi Lee Gregory. If you have a garden or an outdoor space you want to plant but don't know how or even where to begin, Heidi is here to help. Through a simple process, Heidi will work with you to understand your likes and dislikes, style preferences, and what you're looking to achieve with your garden and your planting, whether it be a single bed or a full garden. Heidi will create a personalised plan for you and your space, with plants that suit your soil, light, climate and preferences. For Heidi, gardening has been a lifesaver and a huge part of supporting her mental health. Her belief is that everyone can have a beautiful garden and reap the benefits. Heidi will take the stress out of it and show you how. To find Heidi online, head to heidileegregory.co.uk or on social media at heidilee.gregory. And did you carry on in any way? Did you create any work, any artwork? Did you have any feeling of that you wanted to carry on, creating, to be an artist? Did you have an inclination of where you wanted to go?
It's funny. The thing that pops out for me is that, the idea of being an artist. And the thing that comes to my mind is that I'm not really sure I've ever wanted to be anything.
Mm-hmm.
So I did paint, and I have painted. And what I have found is that whilst I very much enjoy it, I quickly realized that to sell that work and to produce it, I think really wasn't for me. I didn't have a certain degree of patience when it comes to making things.
Mm-hmm.
I think is required.
Yeah, no, I can relate to that.
And I'm not really someone who's especially crafty. And it sounds like a strange thing to say, but I don't get a huge amount of joy or pleasure out of design and crafting. I'm much more an intellectual kind of creative thinker.
Yeah.
But that idea of being something is a very interesting topic. I think that idea of why do we want to say, I was again speaking with a client, we were talking about say being an artist or being a painter or being a photographer or being a writer. And sometimes it's it's about, well, we want actually other people to recognize this in ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
That we want people to see us how we see ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I don't think I've ever had, or I think I shy away from the idea of being an artist or being a coach, not because, and I can completely see it can be a case of, well, I don't want to have that label bestowed upon me, because then I have to live up to people's expectations of what that might entail.
Mm.
But I guess there's also obviously something about labels that feels incomplete.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. It's limiting as well.
Yeah. And again, it's one of those wonderful paradoxes where it's useful in very specific contexts and not so useful if you apply it to the entirety of your life.
Yeah. I find it's so interesting that because everything that you're saying just makes such complete sense that you're a creative coach. It's like, it sounds like a really quite painful at times, difficult journey, and one that possibly you probably, you never looked ahead going, right, okay, I'm going to go to art school and then I'm going to really question everything. And through this and through my own personal emotional journey, I'm going to arrive on the other side and I'm going to realize that what I can do is in some ways intellectualize, the whole process of being not being an artist. I guess the life state of being a creative and everything that brings up and everything that you question. It feels like, because I know that you've done formal training as a coach as well, but it really feels like your own personal story informs your work on a really quite profound level and is kind of a real core, valuable element to it.
Yeah. Something I've learned, and I know that I'm not alone in this at all, something that I've learned is that in a way it's a valuable experience, and it's a valuable lesson to learn that you don't always need to trust your own thoughts. Mm-hmm. In the sense that everything is impermanent. It's very abstract. But there's this freedom and flexibility and fluidity that comes with that understanding that there are all these multitudes and perspectives that you can hold at the same time. And I love that. I love that we can use our very fancy brains to create things and to make things happen that we want to do and take decisions, etc., etc. But we can also live with that understanding that actually a lot of our thoughts are thoughts are unreliable. Like I've had that experience. Like last year, I was walking on this beach, and I essentially was in a very depressed state. And I understand, and what has helped me, is understanding that this low mood is a physiological response to changes in my environment. So when I experience loss, in particular ways, then my body almost like lowers my mood. It lowers motivation. It increases the propensity to like look out for threats. That's almost like what my body is meant to do. It's actually an evolutionary adaptation. And I remember walking along this beach and I distinctly was thinking, I hate everything. I hate there was a dog, and walking about, I was like, I hate that dog. It's like, I hate the people on the beach. I hate the sea. I genuinely hated the sea. And in that particular, and then you get into that mind of like, wow, am I a horrible, am I this, you almost quite, well, I'm going to speak again from my personal experience, but it's like, how am I human? How is this working? Anyway, I thankfully I have a friend who is one of the most wonderful people and one of the most beautiful souls that you will ever meet. And I conjured her up in my mind, and I was like, I can't hate her. And that reconnected me to my humanity.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah. So I highly recommend compassion. I mean, if you can't have it for yourself, very understandable. Try find one person or soul or creature in this life that is your anchor, is your totem. Maybe you could be like, I can't hate that. Yeah. Anyway, the point of that story being that I know that those thoughts are just thoughts. I know that I hate the sea is just a thought. Mm-hmm. It's not my lived truth. It's not the universal truth of my experience. Mm-hmm. And that means that my thoughts are transient. I'm not sure I would say that they are lies when I'm thinking them, but I also would say that I'm not holding them with a lot of weight. I don't place a lot of currency in those thoughts.
Yeah. Yeah. And this makes you think, because one of the things that you have talked about in your approach to coaching is that we have the answers. We have the answers within. So how can we trust those answers while also still, like you just saying, kind of understanding the fluidity of thoughts that pass through us and aren't our permanent truth? Can you answer that?
yeah. It's funny because, as you say, I know I've written that about having the answers within. Mm-hmm. And now I would question that in some ways. Like on one level, it's less about having the answer. And I would say maybe more about having peace with both the answer and also yourself.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So it's less about trying to rummage around and find the answer, although that definitely happens. But I guess from my personal perspective now, it's more about saying this answer is good enough. Like this answer is my answer, and I am going to run with that, but I'm also not going to wed myself to it. I know that I feel like I'm talking in contradictions, but that's truly I don't want to be a cliche and be like it's very zen, but there's something about bringing the energy and spirit into something. Like kind of like I'm going back to nature. Just because not every seed is going to flourish, that doesn't mean that there's not all that energy and potential there anyway. It doesn't mean Mother Nature goes, well, I'm just not going to try with these particular roots or avenues. It's kind of like, well, this is the way. Like does not mean that anything is a waste.
Yeah.
Because all that energy is going to be recycled, composted back into the earth anyway, into yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the word that you used of peace before, as soon as you said that, I felt it. It's like, yeah, that's what it is. It's about just being at peace with the decision that you've made, and kind of like arriving there, meeting that, and yeah, this is enough for now. And it doesn't mean that it has to be permanent and forever, but in that moment, that's where you feel peaceful. Yeah, and I really feel that. I see. Yeah,
so that's what my coaching is about, helping people feel at peace.
That's an incredibly gentle approach, and very I guess about listening, really, isn't it? Listening to where you're at and what the energies are going through your body and how you're responding. And because I do agree, I do sometimes find, like you were talking about, this idea of like fulfilling your potential, this quite kind of can be slightly aggressive approach to coaching, which kind of makes me think of like, football teams or like American football, a coach being like shouting, like, go, and it's very different when it comes to creativity, because it is about our internal world and how we, choose to express that and translate the world through our eyes. And there's so much noise in the world. So to be able to find silence, to find that peace, it's really difficult. So I think that's really a really beautiful approach.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, for me, as you're talking, it comes back to that word connection. If I was going to say, well, sorry, if someone was going to ask me about potential, it goes back to that idea of connection, and not to lord connection over everything else, but there's something of just about being here and experiencing that and being at peace with whatever that brings you, and understanding that you are a human being no matter what, and being able to truly appreciate that.
And so when you work with people, do you work with people on a long term? Is it like for a month, for several months? Is it just like a one-off consultation, or?
So the work that I do, you will probably be not surprised, is not a quick. It takes a lot of movement and questioning to be more at peace with yourself, to accept that you don't have to have all the answers in the traditional conventional sense, and yet you also are able to, I find it difficult to find the word, but I guess a more conventional thing would be like to make progress, is how a lot of people would put it. So I tend to work with people for a minimum of 6 to 12 months.
Right.
Because there's a lot of very under, like, as there would be should be, as like there's going to be a lot of pushing and pulling and questioning, but this is like goes against often everything that I've been taught about the world and how I need to produce and what needs to happen. So, and learning compassion for ourselves is not I don't know about you, but it's not something that I was ever really taught. It's not something that I ever really practiced.
Yeah.
It's not to say that things don't happen in the conventional sense, as in when people come for coaching, a lot of people want to do something, they want to create something, they want a tangible result. And people might be frustrated in the sense that that's not the level that I'm normally working at with people, because while that's incredibly understandable, I want, personally, selfishly, I want people to have a sustainable practice. I want, selfishly, people to really enjoy themselves, to really enjoy who they are, to be able to be really kind to themselves when things don't go the way that they wanted them to.
Yeah. And that's a huge part of the struggle. So that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. And if I have expertise and personal expertise in anything, it's coming from a place where I had absolutely no kindness for myself, to a place where I can be incredibly kind to myself. I can really hold space for whoever I need to be when I am not maybe functioning to a conventional capitalist standard.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, who wouldn't want that?
The Holy Grail, really.
Yeah, and it doesn't mean that everything's wonderful. It doesn't mean that I'm super happy all the time. It doesn't mean that my clients are super happy all the time. But there's something about, for me, there's something about knowing that you can always come back to yourself.
Yeah.
There's something about, people talk about home, and home is a very interesting, multifaceted concept for me. It's not ever somewhere that I've felt as a place or a location. But knowing that I can be at home in my body, knowing that this vessel that carries me is something that, I don't want to say works, but it works with me. It doesn't work against me. We are friends. We love each other. Like that's ultimately what it is. And if you can love yourself no matter what, like that's,
yeah. And I think it's the hugest hurdle that I think many people experience. Again, that's coming back to that simplicity of being in the world and connecting with the world and connecting with yourself, and that being enough and that being okay and not scary. I guess it's the kind of the essence of existentialism and being human. And we all, we try and distract ourselves from it in so many different ways, of relationships, drugs, alcohol, shopping, whatever ways. Because, it's coming back to that core, that simple core of being. We didn't really cover much big stuff, did we?
Yeah, I don't know about you. I feel like we just skirted around everything. But,
Gosh, that's incredibly profound work. Incredibly profound. Wow. Thank you so much for sharing this with me, Kathryn.
Oh, you're very, very welcome. It's funny, as you say that, sometimes I feel like I'm just opening people up to then question everything about their lives.
Well, there is that as well,
But no, so but I know that sometimes needs to happen. Sometimes we do need to, it is that expansiveness. It's almost like that. And then we settle back down, we reconfigure, etc. And there's this roominess, that movement that we get to be like, oh my goodness, I hadn't realized that I was so tight in particular areas. So yeah, maybe that's what coaching is. It's that kind of loosening the knots.
Loosening the knots. I like that. Yeah. I can really relate to that, because I think I have a habit of filling everything up and being very busy and cramming things in everywhere. And I have to really, really keep an eye on myself to allow space to just be and to just feel, and doesn't need to be so tightly packed or so tightly woven.
Yeah. It's an interesting, not to contradict any of that, but there's something about, I only pick up on it because I know that people sometimes talk about, well, we need space for that solitude and connection to ourselves. But I also truly believe that we can do that whenever, like wherever, whenever, with people. There's something about being connected to ourselves at the same time as being connected to other people.
Yeah.
And not to say that you didn't mean that. It's just that I know often the language that we use is around finding quiet time to be, and that makes complete sense, because for most of us, that's how our lived experience is that we don't have much time for ourselves. But as someone who actually does, who's made a lot of space in my life for that, there's also something about knowing that we can feel that level of connection to ourselves when we're also doing things in the company of other people.
Yeah, I understand that. Wow. You've definitely tilted the angle of my day.
That's a lovely way of putting it. I don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I like it.
No, you've given me a lot to think about and ponder on. Yeah, I'm really grateful for how deep you went so quickly.
Oh, you are very, very welcome. That's me all the way, all the time.
Well, I'm so glad to have been here, to have this chat with you. Thank you so much.
No, absolutely, likewise. Thank you.
Yeah, I feel a little bit I kind of don't really know. I feel very moved. I feel really, really moved by what you've shared with me, and what you've made me question, and I guess the questions that you've thrown up, and how honest and how generous you've been, really, in telling me your story. Thank you. I think that's just what I want to say, is thank you, Kathryn.
Thank you. Well, I loved that. That was fun.
Was it okay? You can find Kathryn online at kathrynho.com and on Instagram at Kathryn_ho_. And you can subscribe to Kathryn's newsletters by heading to kathrynho.substack.com. Thank you to Heidi Lee Gregory for sponsoring this episode. Thank you for listening to On the Irregular. Please remember to review and subscribe, as it helps other listeners find us.